Good evening and hi, my name is Evan Winter and I'm the writer of The Rage of Dragons, my debut novel from Orbit Books. And I'm here tonight to read a little bit of it to you. So before I get started with the reading, I wanted to tell you something about the story and how it came to me. I guess you may have heard something like this before, but The Rage of Dragons as a story felt like it was kind of fully formed in my mind. And writing it down and telling the story seemed as if I was doing something akin to an archaeological dig. The story was all there. It was just hidden under a millennia of sand, and I had to go searching for it. So the section I'm going to read right now is from the first 20 pages of the book, and I wrote this in one session. The first 20 pages was the fastest to come out of me, and again, it was written in one session, in one writing session. I didn't have to go back and change too much of it. It's sort of pretty much intact with the way it was written initially. So that I think is kind of maybe an interesting section to read to you, and also I don't really have to set it up because it's the very beginning of the story. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it helps you get some rest tonight, but not that you fall asleep from boredom, but maybe that you fall asleep thinking about wanting to know a little bit more about the story. And before I do actually quite get going, I'll also tell you a little bit about the people who helped me bring this story to you. So, The Rage of Dragons, the cover was illustrated by Carlo Ortiz, the art director was Lauren Panepinto, and my editor was Breet Feed. So they really helped bring the story to you. I do hope you go pick it up and that you read the rest of it and that you enjoy it. And without further ado, here we go. Landfall. Queen Teyfa stood at the bow of Targon, her beached warship, and looked out at the massacre on the sands. Her other ships were empty. The fighting men and women of the Chosen were already on shore, or already killing and dying. Their screams, not so different from the cries of those they fought, washed over her in waves. She looked to the sun. It burned high overhead, and the killing would not stop until well past nightfall, which meant too many more would die. She heard footsteps on the deck behind her, and tried to take comfort in the sounds of Siori's gate. "My queen," he said. Teyfa nodded, permitting him to speak, but did not turn away from the slaughter on the shore. If this was to be the end of her people, she would bear witness. She could do that much. "We cannot hold the beach," he told her. "We have to retreat to the ships. We have to relaunch them." "No. I won't go back on the water. The rest of the fleet will be here soon. Families, children, the old and infirm, not fighters, not gifted." Teyfa hadn't turned. She couldn't face him. Not yet. "It's beautiful here," she told him. "Hotter than Osante, but beautiful. Look." She pointed to the mountains in the distance. "We landed on a peninsula, bordered and bisected by mountains. It's defensible, arable. We could make a home here, couldn't we? A home for my people." She faced him. His presence comforted her. Champion Siori, so strong and loyal. He made her feel safe, loved. She wished she could do the same for him. His brows were knitted and sweat beaded on his shaved head. He'd been near the front lines, fighting. She hated that. But he was her champion, and she could not ask him to stay with her on a beached ship while her people, his soldiers, died. He shifted and made to speak. She didn't want to hear it. No more reports, no more talk of the strange gifts these savages wielded against her kind. "The Malawa arrived a few sunspans ago," she told him. "My old nursemaid was on board. She went to the goddess before it made ground." "Sonura's gone? My queen, I'm so..." "Do you remember how she'd tell the story of the dog that bit me when I was a child? I remember hearing you bit it back and wouldn't let go. Sonura had to call the Queen's Guard to pull you off the poor thing." Teyfa turned back to the beach, filled with the dead and dying in their thousands. "Sonura went to the goddess on that ship, never knowing we found land, never knowing we escaped the cull. They couldn't even burn her properly. The battle seemed louder. I won't go back on the water. Then we die on this beach. The moment had arrived. She wished she had the courage to face him for it. The gifted, the ones with the forward scouts, sent word. They found the rage. Taifa pointed to the horizon past the slaughter, steeling herself. They're nested in the central mountains, the ones dividing the peninsula, and one of the dragons has just given birth. There is a youngling, and I will form a coterie. No, he said. Not this, Taifa. She could hear his desperation. She would not let it sway her. The savages, how can we make peace if we do this to them? Siori said, but the argument wasn't enough to change her mind, and he must have sensed that. We were only to follow them, he said. If we use the dragons, we'll destroy this land. If we use the dragons, the Cull will find us. That sent a chill through her. Taifa was desperate to forget what they'd run from, and aware that could she live 1,000 cycles, she never would. Can you hold this land for me, my champion? She asked, hating herself for making this seem his fault, his shortcoming. I cannot. Then, she said, turning to him, the dragons will. Siori wouldn't meet her eyes. That was how much she'd hurt him, how much she'd disappointed him. Only for a little while, she said, trying to bring him back to her. Too little for the Cull to notice, and just long enough to survive. Taifa, a short while. She reached up and touched his face. I swear it on my love for you. She needed him and felt fragile enough to break, but she was determined to see her people safe first. Can you give us enough time for the coterie to do their work? Siori took her hand and raised it to his lips. You know I will. Champion Siori. Siori stared at the incomplete maps laid out on the command tent's only table. He tried to stand tall, wanting to project an image of strength for the military leaders with him. But he swayed slightly, a blade of grass in an imperceptible breeze. He needed rest and was unlikely to get it. It had been 3 days since he'd last gone to the ships to see Taifa. He didn't want to think he was punishing her. He told himself he had to be here where the fighting was thickest. She wanted him to hold the beach and push into the territory beyond it, and that was what he was doing. The last of the 2,500 ships had arrived, and every woman, man, and child who was left of the Chosen was now on this hostile land. Most of the ships had been scavenged for resources, broken to pieces so the Yomehi could survive. There would be no retreat. Losing against the savages would mean the end of his people, and that Siori could not permit. The last few days had been filled with fighting, but his soldiers had beaten back the natives. More than that, Siori had taken the beach, pushed into the tree line, and marched the bulk of his army deeper into the peninsula. He couldn't hold the ground he'd taken, but he'd given her time. He'd done as his queen had asked. Still, he couldn't pretend he wasn't angry with her. He loved Taifa. The goddess knew he did, but she was playing a suicidal game. Capturing the peninsula with dragons wouldn't mean much if they brought the Cull down on themselves. Champion! An Ndlovu soldier entered the command tent, taking Siori from his thoughts. Major Ojore is being overrun. He's asking for reinforcements. Tell him to hold. Siori knew the young soldier wanted to say more. He didn't give him the chance. Tell Major Ojore to hold. Yes, champion. Harren spat some of the kala leaf he was always chewing. He can't hold, the colonel told Siori and the rest of the assembled Guardian Council. The men were huddled in their makeshift tent beyond the beach. They were off the hot sands and sheltered by the desiccated trees that bordered them. He's out of arrows. It's all that kept the savages off him, and goddess knows the wood in this forsaken land is too brittle to make more. Siori looked over his shoulder at the barrel-chested colonel. Harun was standing close enough for him to smell the man's sour breath. Returning his attention to the hand-drawn maps their scouts had made of the peninsula, Siori shook his head. There are no more reinforcements. You're condemning Ojori and his fighters to death. Siori waited, and, as expected, Colonel Deo Okello chimed in. Harren is right. Ojori will fall, and our flank will collapse. You need to speak with the Queen. Make her see sense. We're outnumbered, and the savages have gifts we've never encountered before. We can't win. We don't need to, Siori said. We just need to give her time. How long? How long until we have the dragons? Tahir asked, pacing. He didn't look like the man Siori remembered from home. Tahir Oni came from one of the Chosen's wealthiest families, and was renowned for his intelligence and precision. He was a man who took intense pride in his appearance. Back on Osonte, every time Siori had seen Tahir, the man's head was freshly shaved, his dark skin oiled to a sheen, and his colonel's uniform sculpted to his muscular frame. The man before him now was a stranger to that memory. Tahir's head was stubbly, his skin dry, and his uniform hung off a wasted body. Worse, it was difficult for Siori to keep his eyes from the stump of Tahir's right arm, which was bleeding through its bandages. Siori needed to calm these men. He was their leader, their Inkokeli, and they needed to believe in their mission and queen. He caught Tahir's attention, tried to hold it and speak confidently, but the soldier's eyes twitched like a prey animal's. The savages won't last against dragons, Siori said. We'll break them. Once we have firm footing, we can defend the whole of the valley and peninsula indefinitely. Your lips to the goddess's ears, Siori, Tahir muttered without using either of his honorifics. Escaping the cull, Deo said, echoing Siori's unvoiced thoughts. Won't mean anything if we all die here. I say we go back to the ships and find somewhere a little less occupied. What ships, Deo? There aren't enough for all of us, and we don't have the resources to travel further. We're lucky the dragons let us here, Siori said. It was a gamble, hoping they'd find land before we starved. Even if we could take to the water again without them leading us, we'd have no hope. Harren waved his arms at their surroundings. Does this look like hope to you, Siori? You'd rather die in the water? I'd rather not die at all. Siori knew where the conversation would head next, and it would be close to treason. These were hard men, good men, but the voyage had made them as brittle as this strange land's wood. He tried again to find words to calm them, when the shouting outside their tent began. What in the goddess's name? Said Harun, opening the tent's flap and looking out. He couldn't have seen the hatchet that took his life. It happened too fast. Tahir cursed, scrambling back as Harun's severed head fell to the ground at his feet. Swords out, Siori said, drawing his weapon and slicing a cut through the rear of the tent to avoid the brunt of whatever was out front. Siori was first through the new exit, blinking under the sun's blinding light, and all around him was chaos. Somehow, impossibly, a massive force of savages had made their way past the distant front lines, and his lightly defended command camp was under assault. He had just enough time to absorb this when a savage, spear in hand, leapt for him. Siori, Inkokeli of the Omehi military and champion to Queen Teifa, slipped to the side of the man's downward thrust and swung hard for his neck. His blade bit deep, and the man fell, his life's blood spilling on to the white sands. He turned to his colonels. Back to the ships! It was the only choice. The majority of their soldiers were on the front lines, far beyond the trees, but the enemy was between Siori and his army. Back on the beach, camped in the shadows of their scavenged ships, there were fighters and gifted, held in reserve to protect the Omehi people. Siori, the colonels, the men assigned to the command camp. They had to get back there if they hoped to survive and repel the ambush. Siori cursed himself for a fool. His colonels had wanted the command tent pitched inside the tree line to shelter the leadership from the punishing sun. And though it didn't feel right, he'd been unable to make any arguments against the decision. The tree line ended well back from the front lines, and he believed they'd had enough soldiers to ensure they were protected. He was wrong. Run! Siori shouted, pulling Tahir along. They made it 3 steps before their escape was blocked by another savage. Tahir fumbled for his sword, forgetting for a moment that he'd lost his fighting hand. He called out for help and reached for his blade with his left. His fingers hadn't even touched the sword's hilt when the savage cut him down. Siori lunged at the half-naked aggressor, blade out in front, skewering the tattooed man who'd killed Tahir. He stepped back from the impaled savage, seeking to shake him off the sword, but the heathen, blood bubbling in his mouth, tried to stab with a dagger made of bone. Siori's bronze-plated leathers turned the blow, and he grabbed the man's wrist, breaking it across his knee. The dagger fell to the sand, and Siori crashed his forehead into his opponent's nose, snapping the man's head back. With his enemy stunned, Siori shoved all his weight forward, forcing the rest of his sword into the man's guts, drawing an open-mouthed howl from him that spattered Siori with blood and phlegm. He yanked his weapon away, pulling it clear of the dying native, and swung round to rally his men. He saw Deo fighting off 5 savages with the help of a soldier, and ran toward them as more of the enemy emerged from the trees. They were outnumbered, badly, and they'd all die if they didn't disengage. He kept running, but couldn't get to his colonel before Deo took the point of a long-hafted spear to the side and went down. The closest soldier killed the native who had dealt the blow, and Siori, running full tilt, slammed into 2 others, sending them to the ground. On top of them, he pulled his dagger from his belt and rammed it into the closest man's eye. The other one, struggling beneath him, reached for a trapped weapon, but Siori shoved his sword hilt against the man's throat, using his weight to press it down. He heard the bones in the man's neck crack, and the savage went still. Siori got to his feet and grabbed Deo. "Go!" Deo, bleeding everywhere, went. "Back to the beach!" Siori ordered the soldiers near him. "Back to the ships!" Siori ran with his men, looking back to see how they'd been undone. The savages were using gifts to mask themselves in broad daylight. And as he ran, he saw more and more of them stepping out of what his eyes told him were empty spaces among the trees. The trick had allowed them to move an attacking force past the front lines and right up to Siori's command tent. Siori forced himself to move faster. He had to get to the reserves and order a defensive posture. His heart hammered in his chest, and it wasn't from running. If the savages had a large enough force, this surprise attack could kill everyone. They'd still have the front-line army, but the women, men, and children they were meant to protect would be dead. Siori heard galloping. It was an Ingonyama riding double with his gifted, on one of the few horses put on the ships when they'd fled Osonte. The Ingonyama spotted Siori and rode for him. "Champion," the man said, dismounting with his gifted, "take the horse. I will allow the others to escape." Siori mounted, saluted before galloping away, and looked back. The gifted, a young woman, little more than a girl, closed her eyes and focused, and the Ingonyama began to change. Slowly at first, but with increasing speed. The warrior grew taller, his skin deep black, darkened further, and moving like a million worms writhing beneath his flesh, the man's muscles reformed, thicker and stronger. The soldier, a greater noble of the Omehi, was already powerful and deadly, but now that his gifted's powers flowed through him, he was a colossus. The Ingonyama let out a spine-chilling howl and launched himself at his enemies. The savages tried to hold, but there was little any man, no matter how skilled, could do against an enraged Ingonyama. The Ingonyama shattered a man's skull with his sword pommel, and in the same swing he split another from collarbone to waist. Grabbing a third heathen by the arm, he threw him 10 strides. Strain evident on her face, the gifted did all she could to maintain her Ingonyama's transformation. "The champion has called a retreat," she shouted to the Omehi soldiers within earshot. "Get back to the ships!" The girl, she was too young for Siori to think of her as much else, gritted her teeth, pouring energy into the enraged warrior, struggling as 6 more savages descended on him. The first of the savages staggered back, his chest collapsed inward by the Ingonyama's fist. The second, third, and fourth leapt on him together, stabbing at him in concert. Siori could see the gifted staggering with each blow her Ingonyama took. She held on, though. Brave thing, as the target of her powers fought and killed. "It's enough," thought Siori. "Leave. It's enough." The Ingonyama didn't. They almost never did. The Colossus was surrounded, swarmed, mobbed, and the savages did so much damage to him that he had to end his connection to the gifted, or kill her too. The severing was visible as two flashes of light emanating from the bodies of both the Ingonyama and the Gifted. It was difficult to watch what happened next. Unpowered, the Ingonyama's body shrank and his strength faded. The next blow cut into his flesh and, given time, would have killed him. The savages gave it no time. They tore him to pieces and ran for the Gifted. She pulled a knife from her tunic and slit her own throat before they could get to her. That didn't dissuade them. They fell on her and stabbed her repeatedly, hooting as they did. Siori, having seen enough, looked away from the butchery, urging the horse to run faster. He'd make it to the ships and the reserves of the chosen army. The Ingonyama and Gifted had given him that with their lives. It was hard to think it mattered. Too many savages had poured out from the tree line. They'd come in force, and the chosen could not hold. The upcoming battle would be his last. Thank you. Thanks for listening. And good night.